Structural Connections in the Brain in Relation to Gender Identity and Sexual Orientation by Burke S., Manzouri A., and Savick I., 2017. Presented by myself, Jules Brown. I am gender fluid and my preferred pronouns are she, he, or they. This study examined the different brain structures of people of diverse gender identities and sexual orientations in order to determine the existence of a physical neurobiological source for these experiences. Specifically, it measured the distribution of white matter at key points in the brain to see if any of these controlled or could be attributed to controlling sexual orientation or gender identity. This study hypothesized that being transgender or homosexual would lead to lower levels of masculinization or feminization in white matter diffusion. The research suggested that the difference between homosexual and transgender white matter would enable them to control for the higher rates of homosexuality in transgender individuals to see what the fundamental differences between a cisgender and transgender brain are. With this MRI method, indicators of white matter microstructure could be derived from the diffusion tensor, such as fractional anisotropy, FA, mean diffusivity, axial diffusivity, and radial diffusivity for fractional anisotropy, are a measure for the relative restriction of water diffusion along the axon. Prominent sex differences have been reported in this instance, with higher fractional anisotropy values in several long white matter tracts, primarily the superior and inferior longitudinal fasciculus, corticospinal tract, corpus callosum, inferior fronto-occipital fasciculus, and forceps minor in men compared to women. However, it is important to note that modern neurology doesn't actually recognize the terms fronto-occipital fasciculus or longitudinal fasciculus as being divided into superior or inferior, as shown in a study by Mayola et al. 2015. This study did not actually make it clear how they were aiming to control for sexual orientation, as there was no data recorded regarding the sexual orientation of the transgender participants. The researchers investigated fractional anisotropy values in 40 transgender men with a mean age of 24, give or take 5.6 years, 27 transgender women with a mean age of 25 years, give or take 5.4 years, and 29 cisgender heterosexual men, average age of 30 years, give or take 5.6. 30 cisgender homosexual women, 28 years of age on average with 6.1 years, give or take, and 40 cisgender heterosexual men, 29.4, give or take 6 years, and 40 cisgender heterosexual women, 29.3, give or take 5.5 years. This study was able to find fundamental significant differences in the white matter distribution of brains, both between sexualities and genders. This specifically meant that the fractional anisotropy values in the corticospinal tract and the quote-unquote superior longitudinal fasciculus were more in accordance with their sex assigned at birth, whereas in the inferior fronto-occipital fasciculus, the fractional anisotropy values were more in accordance with their gender identity. These results had a p-value of 0.042, meaning it was marginally significant. The research indicated that some parts of the brain, for example, the corticospinal tract and the superior longitudinal fasciculus, may develop based on biological sex characteristics, whereas the inferior fronto-occipital fasciculus would develop based on gender identity. Also found that sexual orientation had no effect on the fractional anisotropy of the white matter in these regions of the brain, indicating that gender and sexual orientation have very different biological sources. All FA values were within normal range for a healthy human adult, and other than the parts of the brain mentioned, the differences between all groups was non-significant. This study concluded that the idea of a distinction and partial overlap between the clinical neurobiology of transgender and gender diverse individuals was valid and possible. The strengths of this study lie in the following. The combination of theories about the neurobiology and sexual orientation and gender diversity, and the use of MRI imaging, which is a strong objective measure giving informative quantitative data, and especially useful when compared with subjective measures like questionnaires. This study, however, despite being theoretically sound, had a great many problems, as well as the errors and limitations that have already been mentioned, such as the outdated terminology used to describe regions of the brain. There are many that follow. The first of which is the rather small sample size. This issue was addressed in the paper, which stated that it was the largest sample size they could realistically get with their exclusion criteria. However, other studies, such as the AIDS Council of New South Wales, ACON, and the Gender Centre's Effective and Meaningful Inclusion of Trans and Gender Diverse People in HIV Prevention study, was able to collect over 1,000 transgender research participants. Such a small sample size means that this study may have committed a type 1 error or failure to reject the null hypothesis, in this case due to the low power of the sample. On such a small scale, it would be very difficult to see if the effects documented in these results are applicable across the trans and gender diverse populations. Another issue is the language used in this study. The Australian Human Rights Commission's 2015 paper, Resilient Individuals, Sexual Orientation, Gender Identity and Intersex Rights National Consultation Report, found that using unwelcome and pathologizing language can be at best alienating and at worst traumatizing for transgender individuals. One of the first words used to describe the trans and gender diverse experience in this paper was transgenderism, which is not a word used today as it was used historically as an informal diagnosis and a tool in the inhumane treatment and pathologization of trans and gender diverse individuals. Perhaps it is language like this that led to so few transgender people being willing to participate in the study. This could have been avoided by consulting an LGBTQ+ advocacy service. Another issue with this paper is the ethical issues that come from studying trans and gender diverse individuals with a view to studying why they exist. This was not necessarily the purpose of this study, but it was suggested in the discussion section that the results of this study could be used as the groundwork for identifying why some people are transgender and gender diverse. The Australian Human Rights Commission in 2015 stated that trying to identify why people are transgender has been used in the past to try and manufacture a cure for being transgender. The Human Rights Commission went on to say that there is nothing inherently wrong with being transgender, and that most of the sources of gender dysphoria come from the lack of acceptance by the broader community. Hyde et al. 2014. By looking at gender dysphoria as an innate quality that comes with being trans, instead of seeing it as a symptom of being brought up in a systematically oppressive environment, this paper contributes to the idea that being transgender is a condition that can be cured, an inherently unhelpful and potentially endangering stance. My final criticism of this study is that it treats both sex and gender as a binary experience. The researchers did not mention the possibility of any participants having intersex characteristics, even though 1 to 2% of people are born intersex, as stated by the United Nations Intersex Fact Sheet 2017, and that is potentially 4 people in this study, and with the sample size being so small, this variation could have had some impact on the data. Similarly, this study fails to take into account that gender itself is not binary. According to the report of the 2015 US Transgender Survey, 35% of the nearly 28,000 transgender respondents to the anonymous online survey identified as non-binary. This means that non-binary people, such as myself, make up a significant portion of the trans and gender diverse community. Non-binary genders are not a new invention and have been observed in many cultures historically, as seen in Richards et al. The fallacy of the gender binary is a Western construct, and in its modern iterations is mostly reinforced by systems that benefit from an arbitrary divide between humans, Smith and Payne 2016. This study does not acknowledge non-binary gender or the fact that the gender binary itself is a social construct, instead treating gender binary as an absolute objective fact. Treating an assumption as a fact without any sources is not empirical scientific practice. By ignoring such a large part of the transgender and gender diverse community, this study fails to effectively study that community, instead only studying a small subset of it and behaving as though that data applies to the entire group as a whole. We've already discussed the negative implications of this study, and while they are very much hypothetical, it is really important for researchers to make sure that their studies will not be used to support hate crimes or to justify breaches of human rights. In terms of positive implications, this research could give us some idea about which parts of the brain change over time, being shaped by experiences, and which parts are stagnant after a certain time period. It could also provide clarity with regards to the way sex hormones affect brain development, as transgender people are often exposed to androgens, estrogens, and progestrogens at higher levels than cisgendered people over the course of their lives. My conclusions. In conclusion, while this study raised many interesting points regarding brain development, gender, and sex, its low power, lack of understanding of neuroanatomy, and narrow-minded scope, failing to consider the ramifications of the research, alienating and pathologizing the writing, and an inability to acknowledge the fallacy of both the sex and gender binaries, mean that while the data contains some useful information, it has little value in terms of real-world application. I would recommend that future research work more closely with the community they wish to study and consult others to ensure that respectful language and data is collected, as well as acknowledging any constructs that are assumed to be true instead of treating them as a fact.